Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We are coming up on the fifth Sunday after the Epiphany, this coming Sunday. We're looking at the healing stories in Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 29. But let me begin with the first of the three P's. And this is a prayer that comes from a book called Common Prayer. It's not the Book of Common Prayer, it's a book called Common Prayer. Things are topsy-turvy in your realm, O God. The poor bear gifts of great worth, the dead rise, the meek inherit the earth. Teach us how to live in an upside-down world where we are called to welcome the outcast, prepare a feast for the ragged, and forgive those who offend us. Amen. The second P is perspective. And again, we're coming up on the fifth Sunday after the Epiphany. And the gospel reading from the Gospel of Mark for this week speaks of several healings that Jesus performed. So people in the town of Capernium came out in droves to be healed by Jesus, which raises the question, what are we to make of the healing stories in the Gospels? So for today's perspective, I want to turn to the work of a New Testament scholar named John Dominic Crossan. And he talks about the field of medical anthropology as a way to clarify and help us understand what's going on in these healing stories. In medical anthropology, there is a distinction between curing a disease and healing an illness. So one medical anthropologist named Arthur Kleinman puts it this way. A key axiom in medical anthropology is the dichotomy between two aspects of sickness, disease and illness. Disease refers to a malfunctioning of biological and/or psychological processes, while the term illness refers to the psychosocial experience and meaning of perceived disease. Illness includes secondary personal and social responses to a disease. So disease focuses on the physical, whereas illness includes the social implications of the disease. So a good example of this, and we'll hear it in just a moment when we read the story from Mark's gospel, is the story of Jesus healing the man who had a skin disease. That story includes both of these aspects of healing. So Jesus cures the disease by speaking the word, "You are clean," but then Jesus touches the man. So he heals the illness, which is the social stigma around having this skin disease, and no one wanted to touch a person with such a condition. So Jesus heals in a couple different ways in that story. Now, for us today, we rely on medical science to cure diseases, even as we pray for people who need healing. But in terms of our daily lives, we can replicate the healing of social illnesses associated with diseases or with difference or with pushing someone to the fringes or the periphery, treating people as outcasts. We can address those kinds of conditions, and we can thus heal an illness. And part of the church's mission is to be a site of such healing of illnesses. Be inclusive, be non-judgmental, be tolerant, be motivated by love and grace. Now, another thing that happens, and we'll see it in just a moment in the gospel story, is Jesus casts out unclean spirits. So when we encounter stories about demon possession in the New Testament, we are becoming acutely aware of the difference between the first century context and our own. In today's world, we don't tend to diagnose certain symptoms as demon possession, even though, of course, there are people in the world who absolutely do believe that certain symptoms can be diagnosed in this way as demons possessing the body or mind. But when we encounter exorcism stories in the Gospels, it's important for us to realize that there is a connection between the colonial situation or colonial type situation of the first hearers and readers of the gospel and the language of demon possession. So those two actually fit together, which helps to explain why there are so many of these stories in the Gospels. So we got to step back into the first century. And when we do that, we realize that first century Jews lived under Roman rule. It was a kind of colonial occupation. They were an occupied people. And this had a psychological and also a social effect on the people. Now, people who specialize in the anthropology of religion, there are people in the world now who study this phenomenon, this relationship between quote unquote demon possession and colonialism, or the effects of colonialism. Some of them have studied charismatic movements around the world in post-colonial contexts. So one example of this is in post-colonial Nigeria. And these folks, these anthropologists of religion, tell some incredible stories of people who believe themselves to be possessed by demons. Now, John Dominic Crossan, I mentioned him a second ago, he explains it this way. An occupied country has, as it were, multiple personalities. One part of it must hate and despise the oppressor, but the other must envy and admire its superior power. This split is felt in the bodies and minds of individuals. I want to quote from Frantz Fanon in his book, Wretched of the Earth. I am rereading this book this month because it's Black History Month, but also it helps to process this complicated situation in Gaza and the war that's going on there. So Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth about the psychological effects of the colonial situation says this. Confronted with the colonial order, the colonized subject is in a permanent state of tension. The colonized subject is constantly on his guard, confused by the myriad signs of the colonial world. He never knows whether he is out of line. So that's Frantz Fanon, famous writer about the colonial situation. So the social illnesses of occupation and oppression manifest in physical and mental diseases that get diagnosed as possession, or this complicated situation around tension in the body and this complicated dynamic between colonized and colonizer leads to this situation that sometimes gets diagnosed as possession. So one lesson from the healing and exorcism stories in the Gospels is that God is concerned about the present human suffering of people in the world now, both physical diseases and also social illnesses. And we, as followers of Christ the healer, should be as compassionate as possible with people, trying to help them if they need a cure because of physical or mental ailments, and also work to heal the social stigmas by treating people as human beings and as children of God, regardless of what they're going through. Just love them as Jesus would love them. And in so doing, we contribute to healing illnesses in the world in the social sense. So that brings us to the third of the three P's. This is pieces of scripture. And we're looking at Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 29. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. Jesus came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sunset, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." Jesus answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. A leper came to him begging him, and kneeling, he said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose, be made clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. So verse 29 gives us the setting. This is Capernaum, and this is a carryover from the previous story in Mark's gospel. And it's also still a Sabbath day when this all happens, at least at the beginning of the story. So Capernaum is a town on the northwest coast of the Sea of Galilee. And what's interesting to me as I read these stories about Jesus doing extraordinary things on the Sabbath is that people seem to have no problem with him doing these things on a Sabbath day. He's performing a service for them. But if we were to read ahead in Mark's gospel, say to chapter 3, we would encounter the religious leaders, some of whom had problems with Jesus doing these things on a Sabbath day because of their interpretation of Sabbath law. They viewed him healing on a Sabbath day as a form of work. But when we read the stories that we just read, the people on the ground didn't really care about those kinds of nuances. So Jesus was popular with the people, even as he became a threat to the established order. So still in verse 29, Mark says, "and immediately." So Mark uses this phrase multiple times throughout the gospel, but especially in chapter 1, verses 10, 12, 18, 20, 21, 29, etc., etc. And this is a kind of stylistic feature of Mark's gospel. Mark writes in such a way that it communicates urgency. Everything happens quickly. This happened, and then immediately this happened, and then immediately this other thing happened, and then immediately something else happened, etc., etc. And also, most of the things Mark writes are in the present tense in Greek. So this is really immediate. This happened, this happened, this happened. It's all very urgent. It's almost like Mark is excited to recount these stories. The first healing Jesus performs on the Sabbath day in these stories is in the house of Simon Peter, and Jesus heals Simon's mother-in-law. She was in bed with a fever. Now, it's an interesting question about why Mark includes this story. And it could be because Christian tradition links Mark, the author, with Peter. Peter, according to the tradition, was Mark's eyewitness source. So maybe Mark included this story because it was an important story for Peter. Notice in the story how Jesus heals. He took her by the hand and lifted her up. So Jesus oftentimes can just heal with a word, but he will also often also heal with a compassionate touch. Skipping ahead to verse 32, we're told that it's sunset. So now this is the official end of the Sabbath day, which meant that people could, quote unquote, carry their sick loved ones and not break the Sabbath. Some interpretations of Sabbath law forbade carrying on the Sabbath day because carrying would be considered a form of work. So at sunset, the end of the Sabbath, all of a sudden, all of these people are carrying their sick loved ones to Jesus. And Mark says the whole city showed up, which is hyperbole, but it communicates an idea. And the idea is that Jesus is gaining in popularity. In verse 34, Mark says Jesus cured many. Now, in English, it makes it sound like Jesus didn't cure all of them, that he only healed some of them, or many of them, but not all of them. But that word many, or that phraseology in both Hebrew and Aramaic, is an inclusive term. It's meant to be interpreted as inclusive. It's not exclusive, as in only some of them. It's meant to be inclusive. So the idea is that he healed all who came in contact with him, many, many, many people without exception. Still in verse 34, Mark says Jesus would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. Now, frequently in Mark's gospel, Jesus will tell people he's healed or unclean spirits who know who he is not to say anything, to keep silent or to keep it a secret what he's done. And some scholars have used the phrase Messianic Secret to describe this phenomenon in Mark's gospel. And it's common throughout Mark's gospel. So we see it here in the story we just read. He would not permit the demons to speak. Then skipping ahead a few verses, when he cures the man with the skin disease, he says, say nothing to anyone. Skipping ahead to chapter 3, whenever the unclean spirits saw Jesus, they fell down before him and shouted, you are the Son of God, but he sternly ordered them not to make him known. Skipping ahead to chapter 8, Jesus asks, who do people say that I am? And Peter responds, you are the Messiah. And then Jesus sternly ordered him and the rest of the disciples not to tell anyone about him. And this phenomenon goes on in Mark's gospel. But the idea here is that if people shared widely that a healer was wandering the countryside, whom demons called the Son of the Most High God, which in ancient Judaism was a kingly title. This was the title of Israel's king, a political term. It could jeopardize the mission of Jesus. His mission wasn't just to be a popular countryside healer. His healing work would climax on the cross when he displays through the power of sacrificial love the salvation of humanity from warring, injustice, hate, and all forms of social illness. So that really is the climax of his healing ministry. And by allowing people to let the cat out of the bag early, so to speak, and misunderstand who he is, it might jeopardize that larger mission. One New Testament scholar named Morna Hooker writes this about the secrecy in Mark's gospel. The commands to secrecy are a narrative device which has been used by Mark to draw his readers' attention to the real significance of the story, which is that Jesus came to be acknowledged as a healing Messiah only through the cross. So after healing the entire city of Capernium, as Mark puts it, the narrative then shifts pretty dramatically, starting in verse 35. So the very next thing Jesus does, according to Mark, is he gets up early the next morning, goes alone into a deserted place. Now, I think the key to understanding this lies in the hyperbole that Mark used in verse 33 when he said the whole city came out to see Jesus. And then the disciples said to Jesus as they're hunting for him, everyone is searching for you. So Jesus's fame was becoming a problem. So he goes out to be alone, maybe because he's wrestling with his mission. He could have stayed in Capernaum and, hung a shingle outside a shop door or like come inside for healing or exorcism. And he could have done that, and he could have lived a comfortable life as a kind of town doctor, so to speak. But I think he knows that he's destined to do something more. And so he goes off by himself to clear his head. He goes to a deserted place, says Mark, which is the same phraseology Mark used earlier in chapter 1 after Jesus is baptized and goes out into the wilderness, a deserted place. So the wilderness, or this deserted place, is a place of internal conflict for Jesus. It's almost like a place of battleground for him where he has to clarify what it is that he's supposed to be about. When the disciples finally find him, Jesus tells them basically it's time to go. He's not going to open up a healing shop in Capernaum. He is moving on. So another aspect of Jesus' struggle may have been the knowledge that he had that if he moved on and expanded his ministry, eventually he would get himself into trouble. So maybe there's an underlying temptation here. Either settle down and live a fairly quiet life loved by the locals, or take a risk and head out and expand the movement. Now, I added verses 40 through 42 to this reading. They're not part of the lectionary reading for this coming Sunday, but I added them because I think they communicate an interesting effect of Jesus choosing to leave in this way. So, had Jesus stayed in Capernaum, created a healing shop, he might never have met the man with the skin disease. So Mark says Mark speaking in the present tense here, the man comes up to Jesus begging and kneeling. It's immediate. It happens right away. So there's an implicit lesson here, which I'll return to in just a moment, which is we can't often predict what will happen when we make pivotal decisions in life. But sometimes our decisions open up unanticipated opportunities to change the lives of other people. Our decisions can have positive ripple effects. So by leaving Capernaum, Jesus opens himself to chance encounters like this one with the guy with the skin disease. And in the result of this chance encounter with this guy is he transforms the man's life. Now, I love this particular story about Jesus healing the man with the skin disease because it's a story with two miracles. Now, as we've already seen, medical anthropology distinguishes between curing a disease and healing a social illness. And in this particular story, Jesus seems to be doing both. He cures the disease with the words, "Be made clean," that he speaks to the man. But he also heals the social illness by touching the man. Mark says Jesus was moved with pity. This is a compassionate phrase. Literally, Jesus felt the man's pain in his guts. He felt not only the physical pain the man was enduring with this skin disease, he also felt the social pain of having a skin disease and being denied human touch, being isolated, being alone, being ashamed, being shunned. Jesus felt all of that. He was moved with pity. And so Jesus stretched out his hand, says Mark, and touched the man. Now, Jesus could have just said the words, "Be made clean." But he adds this extra miracle, this healing of the social illness, which fills out the story and I think really has the power that transforms this man's life. So it's out of this wealth of compassion that Jesus feels. He not only cures the disease, but he also heals the illness. He speaks the word and touches the man. So maybe a lesson from all of this for us is to be open to the unexpected encounters with people in our lives. Someone might cross our path today. And if we treat them with kindness, compassion, grace, we just might make a positive impact on their lives. And who knows what the effect ultimately will be in terms of ripple effects beyond that one single encounter. We might be healers in other people's lives. More to come in this coming Sunday's sermon.